Hello, my name is Jeroen Breuer, and in this video I will explain why I created the hybrid placeholder and how it works. In this video I will continue with the demo site that I previously created in this video. You don't necessarily need to watch this video, but I am using the same solution for this video. So why I created the hybrid placeholder. In the GSS projects that I'm using, we use the iRendering content resolvers a lot. I'm a big fan of it. Basically here, when you have a component in Sitecore, you have control over the output. So basically this is a bit like when you're using MVC projects and you have your controller. In your controller you get the Sitecore item and you can modify it, maybe return a custom view model, and then that will be returned to the front end. Now with GSS we have the iRendering content resolver, and we also get our Sitecore item here if we're on a component, and we can also modify that and return some data, for example. And what we like about this is that you can automatically bind data to the component. It has server-side rendering, and you have the current application, the context item, data source item. So you have everything that you need here if you create a custom rendering content resolver. So we use this a lot. Basically this gives us control over how we output things. Maybe just show you a little link. We also use contract first development, where basically we have a data.json and in Storybook we create a React component based on that JSON, and then we have our rendering content resolver that makes sure that the JSON that we output matches the one that Storybook requires. So the data.json is the contract, and we make sure that that we also return this data in Sitecore, and that is why we use the rendering content resolver. But if you use the rendering content resolver, then at some point it could become a little bit slow. And maybe I should just give a demo how it works. So here we have a rendering. So this is a GSS rendering, and here we have a custom content resolver. And if we look at that content resolver, then basically here we can get the data source, we can map some data, and of course this is just an example, but we could render a date here, but we could also fetch some third-party data here. Maybe we have a REST service that we need to fetch some data from and add that to the model here before returning it again to the front end. So this is what a regular content resolver looks like if you implement the iRendering content resolver. So if you have an API call that can be slow, or at least if you add some logic here that takes a long time, then that will result in a slow page. So here we have a normal page, and as you can see, if I navigate a bit, then it works pretty fast. These are just GSS calls, and they work pretty fast. You get your feedback directly. But if we now go to our normal page, nothing happens for a couple of seconds. The user doesn't get any feedback, doesn't know that it's loading or whatever. If we also check the status here, then this page is returned directly, and this one is pending for a few seconds, and then we see it. So if you have a rendering content resolver that is slow, then it will also make your website look slow. It doesn't even give any feedback to the user, no loading bar, nothing, and then the data just pops up when it's ready. So that is the downside of using a custom rendering content resolver, that if it's slow, the user doesn't get any feedback. And that is when I started doing some investigation for the Hybrid Placeholder, and I discovered that there is actually an API available to fetch the content of a specific placeholder. So basically, what I did is that if you fetch the data for the specific placeholder, then it will go through all the rendering content resolvers again. So it will go through this event again. But we have control over some of the variables that we send. So if we do that, we can, for example, send an extra query string and have some data like, is this an AJAX call? And based on that, we can make this content resolver behave differently. So with the Hybrid Placeholder, you can use the iRendering content resolver with the same benefits, with server-side rendering, having the context item available, but the heavy parts can be done later and async. And maybe also just before I'm gonna explain how it works. So this is what happens if you have a normal content resolver. It takes a little while, and if we go to the hybrid, we have like the same component but done with the Hybrid Placeholder, then we navigate directly to it, and then the date can be shown later because we can fetch it with a secondary call. So we have the normal content resolver, and if you look at the Hybrid Placeholder one, then we can see some similarities. We can still get the data source, and we can get the text and the heading. That is all done here, but that is resolved default contents. And then with a secondary AJAX call, we can execute the heavy code, where here it happens at the same time. Here it can happen at a later moment. So if we navigate to the normal page, everything needs to be done in the same GSS call, and you get the feedback pretty late. And if you go to the home page, then it will first do default content and then async content, and the page loads immediately and the date is added later. So the user gets a much quicker response, gets an extra loading state, and doesn't need to wait a few seconds until the new page is loaded. So that is the main reason I created a Hybrid Placeholder, and the big benefit it has. You can use it just like a normal rendering content resolver, but you can split it out and do the heavy loading later if you need some third-party data or anything. And you can give a much quicker response to the user. So again, that's why I created it, and now I will continue on how it works. So the starting point is our rendering. Here we have two new checkboxes: enable hybrid rendering and disable server-side rendering. I can demonstrate the disable server-side rendering later, but for now we need to enable hybrid rendering here, so we know that the Hybrid Placeholder knows that this needs to do a secondary call, so that we need to fetch the data for the regular GSS call, and then we need to fetch some async data once the page is already loaded. So we start with the hybrid rendering content resolver itself. So this, once we have this value enabled, or at least when we just navigate to the page, and we navigate here, then it goes through the hybrid rendering content resolver. This is our entry point. It's still content resolver. It still inherits the iRendering content resolver interface, but it's going to do some extra logic here. So here we're going to read the values. If we want to disable server-side rendering, for now that's not important. The first thing we do is we set the hybrid placeholder data, and that means that that we know that this rendering is gonna be the hybrid placeholder that it needs to do the secondary call. So here we set some data, and we make sure that this data becomes available in the front end, because that is the hybrid placeholder. Of course, it's a React component, and in that React component it needs to do that secondary call to fetch the placeholder data again, but then the async part, and it needs some information, and that information is set here. If you go to the implementation, then we see that basically we create a dictionary here. We store some data in current.item, so it's only stored for the current request, and that data will later be sent to the front end. Here we're going to do some checks. Is it a layout server or is it a hybrid placeholder? It's hybrid placeholder means this is the secondary call. Are we in the secondary call? And in this case, we're not in the secondary call. This will just say, okay, this is the data that we should do during the normal GSS call. And here we do the resolve default content that we implemented here. So this will be done during the normal GSS call. And then the secondary call says, okay, if this is if this is the hybrid placeholder call, then this is the async part that we do, and that means that we can do the heavy part of the code if we want to. So once both have been resolved, then we just return the data again, and this means that we can return the data in two parts if we want to. So if we navigate to this page, so it's one rendering content resolver that returns two parts, and you will also see in the GSS calls that it actually returns two parts. So this is the first GSS call. So here we have the heading, date, and the text, and here we see the date is null because in our default contents we don't set the date, and in the secondary call the only thing we do set is the date. So here the date is empty, and in the secondary call actually heading and text are null and the date is filled. And basically what we do is, so we do two calls, and then in the hybrid placeholder in the React part we merge the JSON. So we get this JSON, we get this JSON, and we merge it together. Once we went through these steps, there is one more thing that happens. So we did the set hybrid placeholder data, and now basically here we just have some information that that says what the current route is. Is layout service request means are you doing a GSS call or not? And here we set the hybrid placeholder data, and once we went through all the content resolvers, then we need to make this data that we set here available in the front end, and that happens with the get hybrid placeholder data. So the get hybrid placeholder data will make sure that we can get this information in the front end. So here we have another extension. This will make sure that we add some data to the Sitecore context. First of all, we need to know the is layout service route, and here we bring the hybrid placeholder data to the front end, and that is where the hybrid placeholder itself comes in place. So as I already showed before, if you have a regular placeholder somewhere, then you can replace it with the hybrid placeholder, and then that will make sure that it can do the secondary AJAX call to fetch the async data. And what this will get is, first of all, we need the Sitecore context in here. So we have the with Sitecore context higher order component. Then we get the Sitecore context here, and here we get the hybrid placeholder data that we released in here. So based on that, we know which components need to fetch to do a secondary call, for example. What we're gonna, I'm not gonna show everything in here, but basically what it does is when the hybrid placeholder is being used, then we have one use effect hook which checks the item ID, which means if you navigate to a new page, then it's going to do this check. It's going to check, do I have some hybrid placeholder data in my Sitecore context? If I do, then I know the placeholder name that I'm on, and if I should do a secondary call to fetch placeholder data. And if that is true, then I'm actually going to call the fetch placeholder call, and that is this call. It's going to do this call, get this information, and once we have that data, then so we have the first call. So here we have these fields, then we have these fields, and then we, through update elements, we know that the elements can be merged together, and we also have the set is loaded here, so that can change the loading state. So that is what you see here. So if we navigate again to this page, so first if I navigate to it, is loaded will be false, and then after the fetch placeholder data is loaded will be true, and that is what we'll see. Is loaded is false, and then is loaded is true because we fetched all the data that we needed. Before I'll continue with how this call looks. First of all, let's open the rendering again. So by setting this enable hybrid rendering, the secondary call will only return this rendering, and it will ignore other this placeholder, as you can see here, also has a content block, but that is not being returned in this call because the content block already has all the information here, so it doesn't need to be returned in the async call, so we can ignore that. And that is done with the perform hybrid rendering. So this is a Sitecore pipeline that will get all the renderings, and it will work as a normal get renderings, but in this case, if we do the hybrid placeholder call, we have some extra parameters, and we have the is hybrid placeholder. If we have that, we can check, do we have any elements that have the enable hybrid rendering, and if we have that, only then return this element. So by checking enable hybrid rendering here, the perform hybrid rendering check will check, okay, do we need to return this rendering in our secondary call? and that is what is done here. And then, so because here we say, okay, do the secondary call to fetch the placeholder, then it will come back in the hybrid rendering again, go through all these checks, but now we see that the hybrid placeholder is enabled, so we can call the resolve async content, and that will actually go through this one. So if you navigate to this page, even though this rendering will be called twice, the first time it will only do this code, and the second time it will only do this code. So it will never run this 2 times or this 2 times. What is possible is that it actually supports server-side rendering. So if I navigate to this page through a GSS call, we have a loading first and then see it. But if I do a normal page load, the data is immediately fetched. So that is something that can be enabled. Maybe also give a quick demonstration about that. So now, even if I refresh, it will always do the secondary call, and it will, but because it needs to do the secondary call, it doesn't have server-side rendering, of course, but I can disable that again, and actually also support server-side rendering, which is good for SEO, of course. So navigating through the page as a single page application will be loaded later. And then if an SEO or something will render the page, it actually renders it immediately, which is an option which you can enable or disable if you want to. But that is also one of the benefits of using the hybrid placeholder and using a normal iRendering content resolver. You can still have server-side rendering, and if you have server-side rendering, then in one call it will do this check and it will do this check. So even though it's possible to do both separately, they will be done separately if you navigate as a single page application. If you go to a page directly through a refresh, then both of these events can be executed, and they can be done together. So then one final step, if we go back to the hybrid placeholder, so if it did the secondary request and it has this separate data, it needs to merge those. So here we have merged the async data from the second request with the data fetched in the first request, set the is loaded to true, and that is what I also showed before. That's what happens here, but by setting the is loaded here is true, we can actually go to our example itself. Here we have this is loaded drop, which can decide, like, should I show a loading state or should I show the date, and that is what happens after we finally set the is loaded here to true. So that is basically how the hybrid placeholder works. So we have a few things. We have the hybrid rendering content resolver, we have the context extensions, we have the perform hybrid rendering, those, and of course we have the component itself. Those are the most important parts of the hybrid placeholder. They make the hybrid placeholder work. In the context wrapper, we just have some information about the context that we need. And then of course we have the content resolvers. We have the hybrid placeholder one that can load the data async, and we have the normal one that needs to do all the loading at once, which will make the page a lot slower in giving feedback, while the other one is a lot faster, even though it still supports server-side rendering. So that was my video. So I explained why I created a hybrid placeholder. I also explained how it works, and hopefully someone else will also like the hybrid placeholder and will also start using it.